Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history. America's affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time this hour talking about economics. A lot of what we're going to be talking about comes from my book, Christians in Economics. And even though there are 13 chapters in this book, really we're just going to focus in this 1 hour on the first 3 chapters. And you will say, well, just 3 chapters out of a book that long? Well, you'll begin to see how very significant it is when you begin to talk about what the Bible has to say and how Christians should think about the subject of money and economic issues. So we're going to try to cover a number of things this hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, you can leave a message on Facebook, because we also broadcast on Facebook Live. But in most cases, I encourage you maybe just sit back and listen, and to take some of the information that I've pulled together over these many years of study and try to educate us about how Christians could think about economics and money. And if you think about it, the Bible has a lot to say about money. As a matter of fact, if you start looking at every time the word money is mentioned, finances, gold or silver, you actually probably have more verses that deal with money than any other topic in the Bible. And so certainly there are a lot of principles, but let me put down 4 just in this first segment, and then we'll get into some specific aspects of that in terms of consumerism and materialism, what we might think about in terms of giving and tithing. And then especially I wanted to focus a fair amount of time and attention before we end this hour on the issue of capitalism and socialism. We have a generation that really has bought into the idea that maybe capitalism isn't such a good idea, free market isn't the best way to go, and socialism is a better way to go. And we want to look at that from a biblical point of view as well. So just a lot of things to cover. And again, if we want to start applying some biblical principles, you might want to take some notes. And the first one you might want to put down is Matthew 6:24. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, I might just mention, for those of you that even want to follow along, we do have a PDF that's on the website, pointofview.net. You can follow along, or you could print it off later. And there, on each one of these biblical principles, I give you some application. Here, when Jesus says we can't serve both God and money, really what I think we are talking about here is that God wants us to have right priorities concerning money, which kind of brings us back to the question, why does the Bible spend so much time talking about money? Is it somehow materialistically oriented? No, I think what it is that if you say you have a certain set of priorities, the best way to check whether those priorities are really being actualized is to look at how you spend your time and your money. I've said many times, especially when I've spoken at men's groups, that you can tell me what your priorities are, but then show me your checkbook and show me your day timer. Or now, since we have a lot of electronic stuff, show me what's on your digital calendar and show me what your online giving or whatever, because how you spend your time and your money really shows your priorities. And here Jesus in Matthew 6:24 is reminding us that we need to have the right priorities towards money. Let's spend a little bit of time in the Old Testament, because the Proverbs are just replete with examples about money. Proverbs 13, verse 22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And so I think the obvious biblical principle might be that God wants us to provide for our family and leave a legacy. That can be in a variety of different ways. Maybe you meet with a certified financial planner. Maybe you decide to have a will. Maybe you decide to have an insurance policy. Certainly, there is a very strong emphasis in Scripture to provide for your children, and in this case, your children's children. So to begin to think further down the road and not to be focused just on the immediate, but to look at what actually could be taking place in the lives of your children and even your grandchildren. Let's look at another proverb, Proverbs 21:20. It says, "In the house of the wise are stores of choice food and oil, but a foolish man devours all that he has." And so I think what that is telling us is that God wants us to save and thus provide for our future. In a sense, save for a rainy day. Now, I might just point out that we actually have state legislatures, Texas legislature being one that I'm familiar with, that actually has what's called a rainy day fund. And when you have a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, or you have some unexpected disaster, you have money set aside. Unfortunately, that may happen in some states. It certainly doesn't happen in the federal government, which has run up a lot of debt. And we'll get into the subject of debt in just a minute. But I think we certainly as individuals should have that as well. And the sad reality is most of us don't have savings. I have, on many of my commentaries, pointed out that most people, if they have any kind of emergency, they need to buy a set of tires, their air conditioner goes out, their refrigerator, freezer goes out, they would have to put it on a credit card because they don't have money set aside. And it seems to me here that it says the house of a wise man has stores of food and oil, but a foolish man devours all that he has. And we have a government that not only devours all that it has, but it even goes into debt. And so I think as we go through this, we can see that sometimes we corporately as a country and we individually sometimes have violated some of these biblical principles about finance. Well, one more from the book of Proverbs, and that is Proverbs 22:7. It's one that sort of relates to what we've just been talking about. "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender." And so it is a comment, obviously, about debt. Now, is all debt wrong? No. I mean, the fact that there are even principles about indebtedness and relieving indebtedness and those kinds of things in the Scriptures suggests that certainly some kind of debt or an occasional debt is certainly something that an individual might engage in. But the issue is that I think the focus there is that God wants you out of debt and not to be enslaved by debt. Now, if you're listening right now and you have a lot of debt, you know what I mean, because here it says the borrower is a servant to the lender. Some of the translations say a borrower is a slave to the lender. And you know exactly what that might mean. You say, I'd love to go on a vacation. And your spouse says, how can we afford to go on a vacation? Because we have all this credit card debt. You say, I need a new car. And you say, yeah, but I don't even have the current car that I have paid off. Well, you can recognize that sometimes debt is a debilitating factor, and the borrower sometimes has, if you will, power over the lender. This is something even at a national level some people have become concerned about, because indeed the United States has gone from being the largest creditor nation in the world to perhaps the largest debtor nation in the world. This was a nation that not so long ago after World War II extended all sorts of credit, helped rebuild war-torn World War II areas of the countries around the world. And now, of course, we have so much debt and owe it to China, Saudi Arabia, many other countries as well. And that as well affects perhaps our foreign policy, what we say to those nations, and how we interact with many of them as well. So those are just a couple of biblical principles about finance. When we come back, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about materialism and consumerism, one of the chapters in my book, if no other reason, just because that is something that we as Christians, especially in this modern world, have to address. And then we'll move on from there to a few other issues as well, like giving and how to really begin to invest in God's kingdom. And then maybe a little bit more on debt before we talk about the free enterprise system. So today, talking about Christians and economics, we'll take a break. We'll take on.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Liberals have been engaged in Nazi name-calling for more than a half a century. It's been a way to vilify and marginalize Republican candidates and their conservative supporters. Jerry Tuma claimed his 1948 Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, was a frontman for fascists. During the 1964 presidential campaign, the governor of California suggested Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had the stench of fascism. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan replaced him as governor and was called a Nazi so many times, first as governor and then as president, that it would be hard to even get an accurate count. And it has been hard to count all the times George W. Bush and Donald Trump have been given the Nazi label. The purpose of calling candidates and supporters Nazis was to intimidate them and back them off their agenda. But times have changed. Donald Trump and many of his supporters don't seem to care what you call them. Moreover, many other politicians have been called Nazis for so long it's hardly having any kind of meaning or impact. This turn of events has put Nazi name-callers in a difficult situation. Is this all just rhetorical hyperbole, or do they really mean what they say? If it is the former, then they really are just name-calling and don't really believe that the president, other candidates, and their supporters are equivalent to the Nazi regime. But they may really believe what is happening in America is similar to what was happening in Germany in the 1930s. If that is the case, then they feel a moral obligation to take violent action against Trump, Trump's cabinet, and Trump supporters. The recent speeches and actions by members of Congress and liberal political leaders indicate they aren't just name-calling. They really seem to believe they are fighting evil incarnate. That is why the conflict is increasing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, going through some of the material in my book, Christians and Economics, and one of the later chapters, which I will spend just a little bit of time talking about, focuses on the issue of materialism and consumerism. While we're looking at that from a biblical point of view, we can see that, first of all, materialism feeds our greed. The parable in Luke 12, it's a story of a rich man who decides to tear down his barns to build bigger barns, is a good example of sometimes the misplaced priorities. And of course, just a minute ago, we talked about we cannot serve both God and mammon. So sometimes not only materialism feeds our greed, we always want more, but more than that, materialism sometimes creates divided loyalties because it causes us to want to serve both God and mammon. And Jesus says we can't do that. Another example of that I have on our PDF that's available at our website, pointofview.net, is that materialism can really dull God's direction in our life. The Apostle Paul, for example, in Philippians 3, talked about the fact that I counted all things as lost. And in Philippians 4 even said that he learned to be content in whatever circumstance he found himself in. But oftentimes when you have certain kinds of materialistic benefits, it's not so much what you own, it's what owns you. And so that's an issue as well. And as we'll come to in just a minute, as I look at some of these key verses, materialism also can lead to pride and arrogance. For example, Proverbs 28 says that the rich man is wise in his own eyes. We have to pay attention to the fact that in the scriptures, sometimes they really talk about the danger of wealth, the danger of affluence. And those of us that are listening to this program obviously are affluent, especially from a biblical point of view. were some of the wealthiest Christians that have ever lived. And so if it was true to warn affluent Christians and affluent people in the first century, how much more valuable and important is it to warn us in the 21st century? Let's get into a couple of those issues. Wealth and pride. One verse that I thought was appropriate would be in Ezekiel 28, 4 and 5. It says, "By your wisdom and understanding you have gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasuries." But then it goes on to say, "Because of your wealth, your heart has grown proud." There's a sense in which sometimes when you are affluent, when you have done very well, you sort of say, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. Or the sense is, well, I don't really need God. Look at what I did on my own. As I've said before, we don't really pray for our daily bread. We just thank God for the daily bread we already have. And so sometimes there's a tendency for wealth to create pride. The other that the scriptures talk about is how wealth can sometimes cause us to forget about God. And there's an understanding there as well, because when you think about this, if indeed all my material benefits and needs are being met on a regular basis, maybe I don't really tend to think about God so much. It's one thing to pray that God would bring you the resources necessary or bring you food. It's another thing to thank God when you get around to it for what you already have. And Proverbs 30, verse 8 and 9 says, "Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I may not be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?'" And so it's interesting. Proverbs warned about the possibility that we might just begin to be so self-sufficient that we would even forget about the fact that what we own and even the next breath we take is due to God's gracious phenomenon in our own life, his gracious provision for us in life. One last example of that is in Hosea. The book of Hosea is not one you would look to necessarily to talk about finances or a biblical view, but it's interesting that in Hosea 13, verse 6, it says, "As they had their pasture, they became satisfied, and being satisfied, their heart became proud, and therefore they forgot about me." Well, this is the whole idea of materialism. Just for a minute, I also want to talk about this idea of consumerism. Now, consumerism is more than just materialism. It's really just kind of this idea of perceiving the world as a consumer. One of the things that we talk about so often here on Point of View is sometimes even people, when they come to church, they come with sort of a consumer mentality. Well, if I like the pastor and I like the facilities and I like the preaching and I like the music, well, then I'll come. But if, something isn't fit, I'll go somewhere else. Just the way I would probably go somewhere else if I didn't like a fast food restaurant, or get a different house if I didn't like the house. And yet the idea is we sometimes bring this consumer mentality even inside the church. And so one of the books that came out years ago was really based on kind of a secular study. It even became a PBS study, was called Affluenza. And just to help us understand, it said that we spend more money on shoes, jewelry, and watches than we do on higher education. We spend more money on auto maintenance than we do on religious activities. Matter of fact, they found that we spend more money buying Christmas presents for our pets than we do for our next-door neighbors. So the point that they were making is that in some respects, materialism and this idea of affluenza has really begun to take over. And so as a result, one of the polls that was done found that about 85% at that time, this poll's a little bit old now, thought that our priorities were out of whack, and nearly 9 in 10 said American society is too materialistic. So if nothing else, again, just another warning that we live in a world where it has become sort of routine for us to enjoy the fruits of our labor and to enjoy the affluence, but we're raising a next generation of children and grandchildren that may become too spoiled because we don't help them understand that all that they have ultimately comes from the hand of God. Let's begin also, just before we take a break, talk about this idea of giving. And, of course, the debate and discussion sometimes has to do with the issue of the tithe. And the word tithe means a tenth part. And so if you talk about that, you recognize that very few people actually tithe. Now, in the Old Testament, the tithe had a very significant meaning. In Leviticus 27, it was a tithe of everything, and as a result, it applied to everything in the land. It belongs to the Lord. It was holy. It was to be set aside. And of course, that was very instrumental in, if you not only, if you will, keeping the nation of Israel together, but also funding, if you will, the clergy. At that time, of course, they were called the high priests. And so when you come to the New Testament, we talk about this, and there's really no explicit command to tithe, because the primary reason for the tithe was for the Levites and the priests in the temple. And so since we don't have priests and temples and Levites today like we had in the Old Testament, then certainly we wouldn't necessarily believe in a tithe. But what I think is so striking is that even though the tithe is probably not something in the New Testament, if you look at the writings of almost all the early church believers and some of the church fathers, they just sort of assume, since first of all, many of the Christians were Jewish, and then some of the others that maybe were Gentiles had come from some idea of tithe, that they just sort of assumed that that would sort of be the baseline for giving. But the New Testament is very clear in 1 Corinthians 16 and in Galatians 2 that we are instructed to give to those who minister to us. We're also to give to those who trust God to supply their needs. And, of course, in 2 Corinthians 9, probably the best known passage and section here, it is that we are to give cheerfully, not under compulsion, but we are to give cheerfully. And so certainly that is an important issue. Now, when we talk about tithe, there's some things that really surface very quickly, and that is we recognize, as we have talked about sometimes in our Millennial Roundtable, that the younger you are, the less likely you are to give. The study that came out a number of years ago with George Barna, we've talked about it here on Point of View, found that if you look at the builder generation, those born before the end of World War II, up until 1946, they, as individuals giving to missions and Christian organizations and churches, gave at the highest percentage. Then when you look at the so-called baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964, a lower percentage. By the time you get to what's called the baby buster generation and the millennial generation, you can call them Gen X and Gen Y, whatever you might want to call them, that is the lowest percentage. So there is a real concern that unless that turns around, a lot of the churches and Christian organizations will really be struggling as the older, more generous givers die off, go to be with the Lord. The younger ones aren't coming back with the same kind of dedication and sacrificial giving. One other thing I'll mention before we take a break, and that is the interesting phenomenon that if you actually make lots of money, you tend to give less. Those, for example, that gave the tithe, a very high percentage of people that under, say, the $20,000 a year to $40,000 a year range gave much more significant in terms of percentage than those who actually make more than $75,000. So again, the more you make, sometimes the less likely you are to tithe, which is, again, an interesting statistic. A lot of it found in the book. We're going to take a break and get into some more specific and practical questions right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our teaching now on the subject of Christians and economics. Again, a lot of it comes from my book, Christians and Economics, which we do make available at the website, pointofview.net. The PDF of what we're talking about is also available there, so you can follow along. And in this last half hour, I wanted to spend some time talking about biblical principles about economics, as well as the whole issue of the free enterprise system and capitalism versus socialism. Now, when you think about this, the Bible really does give us some pretty good principles about economics. One of those has to do with the fact that we've already listed so many verses that have to do with economics. If you look at Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, he not only asks the question, what is a price, but what is a just price? Calvin, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, talks about this. And it used to be that theologians would spend a fair amount of time addressing economic issues, but today we've sort of divorced theology and ethics away from economics. But nevertheless, whether you've in the last hour heard me speaking about some of the verses in the Proverbs, some of the parables of Jesus, even the principle of New Testament giving, we have lots that the Bible says directly about economics. But I want to back up and ask another question. That is, if we take seriously a biblical view of human nature, does that have any influence in understanding and evaluating economic systems? Because obviously, first of all, we recognize that we're created in God's image, and thus that means we have rationality, and so we are able to make wise choices. We're able to control an economic system. But we also recognize that we are sinful, thus tend towards greed and exploitation. And so there was certainly a need, if we're going to develop an economic system, that on the one hand frees up individuals to make wise choices, but on the other hand certainly also recognize how important it is to protect people from those dangers. So having the fact that we are created in the image of God, we have a rationality and responsibility, which means we can choose between competing products and services. When you go into a grocery store, you go into an electronic store, you can make wise choices, and those choices can function within a market economy where we can exercise the power of choice. But back to this idea of human sinfulness, we recognize that that manifests itself in things like selfishness, greed, exploitation, and so as a result, we obviously need some kind of protection from economic system and from sinful effects, and we would certainly be concerned about any system that concentrates power, economic power, in the hands of a few, because again, all of sin falls short of the glory of God. So if indeed we understand that, we certainly recognize that there is, first of all, human sinfulness, but also because of Genesis 3, we also recognize that not only is human nature fallen, but the world is fallen. The world has become a place of decay, of scarcity, which would also mean that we have to be good stewards of the resources that we have. So that brings us into how we evaluate some of these economic systems. And socialism, in large part, is based upon the teachings of Karl Marx. And one of the things I learned when I went to graduate school is that very quickly, if I took seriously a biblical view of human nature, I could eliminate a lot of economic and political systems because they were based upon a false view of human nature. Let's take Karl Marx and the foundations of socialism, because Karl Marx argued that the reason we have greed is due to the wrong economic foundation. This wrong economic foundation creates a false cultural superstructure, and as a result, the reason people are greedy is because capitalism makes them greedy. So his argument would be to replace capitalism with socialism that eventually would turn into communism. And so this would be the elimination of private property. But does that also contradict a biblical idea? Because the Bible teaches, in one sense, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything ultimately belongs to the Lord. Psalm 24. But at the same time, it also challenges us to have dominion over the creation. We see that in Genesis 1. And really, there's an assumption that runs all the way through even the Old Testament law code of private property, because it does grant private property rights. Matter of fact, you think about it, here's an easy one, the Ten Commandments. One of the Ten Commandments is about stealing. Well, stealing obviously presupposes that you have private property rights. Matter of fact, in Exodus 22, physical force is allowed to protect property. So obviously you would have to say that property, if you believe that private property is a good thing, then you would have to reject the idea of Marxism. Now, the reaction I get from some Christians, sometimes that live in socialist countries, is, well, yeah, but wait a minute. Let's go back to the book of Acts. In Acts 2, it tells us that the early Christians shared their property in kind of a communal arrangement. It's kind of an economic koinonia that took place. But I think, again, you can see that there was still the idea that people own their property, because later on in Acts 5, you have Ananias and Sapphira, and there, what does Peter say to them? Was that not your own before you gave it? I mean, they did not reject the idea of private property. As a matter of fact, they retained the private property rights until they voluntarily gave those up. And again, I think there are times in which Christians throughout the century have said, we want to have a communal nature, or we want to be in a monastery, or we want to help one another. Those are all voluntary. That's very different than socialism that says from owning private property. And one of the examples I even use in the slides that you will see here is, what about the Pilgrims themselves? Because when the Pilgrims first came to this free world in 1620, they were required by their charter from England that the land had to be held in common so that each person would contribute to the community. But William Bradford found out that was a disaster, because the communal system encouraged laziness and inefficiency. Some were saying, I would work all day and I receive just as much as a person who hasn't worked or taught or is lazy or maybe isn't really that entrepreneurial. The colony, he established private property rights and distributed plots of land to each pilgrim. And it brings us back kind of the biblical view of work, because work is not just a result of the fall. It was part of the creation order. And really, if anything, work is something that we are to actually produce. Well, God created us to work the land. We see that in Genesis 1. Because we're created in God's image, we can find work rewarding and empowering. There should even be satisfaction in work. And most importantly, Colossians 3:23 says that we work obviously for our boss, but ultimately we work as if that boss is really the Lord, because ultimately the Lord is our boss. And so we certainly are to work. And if nothing else, there are a lot of admonitions about those who did not work and were not efficient. Proverbs 24, verses 30 to 34 says, I passed by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall had broken down. Poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. And it's just a reminder, again, of the fact that we are to work heartily unto the Lord, because ultimately we are working to please Him. At the same time, of course, we also recognize, once we talk about the need to have some protection, one of the other books I would certainly recommend is Christians and Politics, because we recognize that there is a role for government in the economic system as well. There may be times, for example, when the government needs to step in Leviticus 19, in Deuteronomy 25, Proverbs 20, and other passages, that weights and scales are to be honest. So there's a role for government to make sure the rules of the game are set. Also, Leviticus 19, the principle of contracts and procedural justice. Even a civil justice system. What happens when somebody cheats you? Well, again, we have to have not only rules of the game, but we have to have a means of redress, and that is certainly the case. And in some cases, when individuals are engaged not just in political discrimination, but sometimes economic discrimination, we have that responsibility as well. So in the PDF that we have here, we have all sorts of places where we talk about not only this issue of work and certainly economic systems, but how a government should, in some places and in very significant ways, be involved. But when we come back from the break, what I want to do is say, well, if indeed government has a role, how big is that role? because today we have many that want government to take over more and more areas of our life and ultimately move us towards socialism. But if you go back and understand what a free market looks like, what capitalism looks like, you'll recognize that it's a system in which bad people can do least harm and good people have the freedom to do good works. So we'll look at the writings briefly of Adam Smith, look at a couple of the criticisms and try to answer some of those as well. And if you find yourself saying, I'd really like to watch this again or hear this again or see some of the material, you can go to our website and receive some great material, one of which is the PDF of the presentation I'm giving right now, as well as, of course, you can download the podcast and listen to it or watch it again. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, one of the things we're doing today is going through my book, Christians and Economics, and I thought we would conclude by looking at one of the chapters dealing with capitalism and socialism. Some very good reasons for that. First of all, the younger you are, the more likely you are to believe that socialism is better than capitalism. Still, it's not a majority, but still, I think it illustrates the need maybe to go back and do some teaching. Well, the idea of a free market system goes back to a man by the name of Adam Smith. He wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. And he was really arguing against what was called the mercantile economic system. And it was based upon three major premises. First of all, self-interest. And that is the idea that indeed it is not, as he said, from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And so, first of all, it recognizes that there is self-interest. Second of all, there was this idea of the invisible hand. He said neither intends to promote the public interest, yet they are led by an invisible hand to promote an end that is not part of his intention. And so the first idea was self-interest, the second idea was private property, and the third, he used a French phrase, came from the French physiocrats, called laissez-faire. And that is, in other words, there needed to be a lowering of government intervention. Government didn't need to get involved in the economic transactions because these economic transactions would oftentimes work themselves out, almost led by an invisible hand. Now, key to his belief was also a belief in private property, because after all, private property was not to be held in common, but could be freely traded in a market system, that profits could be generated from the use and exchange of this private property, and this, in a sense, made every person accountable to his own productivity. And so this idea of laissez-faire and minimization and the limiting of the role of government had some advantages, because what it not only did was it actually liberated economic potential. It allowed individuals to pursue whatever they might want to do, their entrepreneurial activities, and to receive the benefits from that. But when you minimize the role of government, not only did it bring about a great deal of economic freedom, it also brought out a great deal of political freedom, because the government was not as involved in your life. When you limit the scope of government in economics, you also limit the scope of government in every other area. And one of the things I put in the PDF, which we're making available on our website, pointofview.net, is a chart that came out a number of years ago, and now the numbers look just as good as they did then. And that is when you look at those countries that have freedom. And each year, Heritage Foundation puts together a list of freedom countries, from those which have the greatest amount of freedom to those which have the least amount of freedom. When you divide them into quartiles, or that is 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, you find those countries which have the greatest freedom also have the greatest amount of economic prosperity. And those countries which have the least freedom have the least amount of economic prosperity. And so you can begin to see that, if nothing else, a free market not only gives us freedom, but it also gives us tremendous affluence. Now, before we end, let me just mention there are all sorts of economic and moral criticisms. I won't go through all of them because they're in my chapter in my book. But one of the economic criticisms is that we sometimes, because of a free market, have monopolies. And sometimes monopolies develop for one of two reasons. Either too little government, and, if you go back and look in the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that may have been the problem. There was not enough regulation, and certain industries just took over. Or sometimes too much government, and those tend to be the more significant ones, because some of the largest monopolies are either government-sponsored or government-sanctioned. So, again, recognizing that that could be a problem, many times it has to do with too much government, not too little. Another argument about free market is, well, what about pollution? When you allow individuals to do whatever they want on their own land, they're going to make a big mess. Not if they live on their land, first of all, because, again, this is, to use an economic term, a problem of what are called externalities. That is, the cost to clean up the pollution is external to the firm. And, of course, I think there's a place where certainly government regulation in some cases is helpful, but even knowing how to reconfigure property rights are very helpful as well. And then we have these moral criticisms, and that is, one of the ones that I hear most often is, well, I don't like capitalism because it makes people greedy. Well, okay, I think we have to recognize that sinful people are going to use capitalism or a capitalist system to feed their greed. But really, again, people would be greedy in socialism as well. I say capitalism is a system in which bad people can do least harm and good people have the freedom to do good works. First of all, it's a system in which bad people can do least harm, because if you have a decentralized economic situation, there may be a greedy person over here, but you don't have to go to their store. You can go to another store. You may not like that particular product. You may not like the attitude. You may not like the way that person in that restaurant treats you. You may not like the selection of goods there. Well, in a decentralized economy, inefficient people, lazy people, greedy people, bad people, they can do the least harm because you have other choices. But it's also a system not only in which bad people can do least harm, it's also a system in which good people have the freedom to do good works, because since you've limited the role of government, they have the greatest amount of freedom to pursue what they might want to actually pursue. And a lot of this comes back to the argument that, well, this whole system is based upon self-interest. Yes, but I think you have to recognize that there is a fundamental distinction you might want to make between self-interest and selfishness. Because if you think about it, almost everything you do in an average day, you're doing out of some self-interest. It's your self-interest to get up and take a shower and to eat because you need to have sustenance. It's in your self-interest to go out and get a job. It's in your self-interest, if you think about it, to accept Jesus Christ as Savior. I mean, let's just be honest for a minute. A lot of what we do is in our self-interest. And you can do things that are in your self-interest that aren't necessarily selfish. You know, selfishness would be like when you've got a pie in the refrigerator and you know there's 4 people in the house and you eat more than a fourth of the pie. Okay, you can say, well, that is something. So again, we recognize that are going to have sometimes guilty, greedy, sinful people. And so a system that does not concentrate power in their hands is a better system than one that does not. And finally, there's kind of this idea of the zero-sum game, you know, that every success in capitalism is really based upon somebody else's failure. But the reality is, and I would point you to a wonderful book by Jay Richards called Money, Greed, and God. He talks about how he learned how a free market works even in kindergarten. It's a wonderful little story, but it, I think, just illustrates once again that when we talk about these issues, if nothing else, we can begin to understand that really when we focus this from a biblical point of view, that, again, we can do these things in a way that does not harm other individuals. And really what the free enterprise system does is it raises everybody. A rising tide floats all boats. And so, again, anything that actually increases our affluence is a good thing. Well, there's a lot more to cover, but simply running out of time. So let me again point you to the book, Christians and Economics, or also my previous book, Christians and Government. These are attempts to really begin to think biblically about every area of life, but especially to apply biblical principles to the government, to politics, to economics, and to money. And I think in this last hour, if nothing else, you've learned once again that the Bible says a lot about money. It says a lot about materialism. It says a lot about economic issues. And if anything, it's important for us as Christians to be thinking about these issues from a biblical point of view. Our goal here at Point of View is to help you to really be able to articulate a biblical worldview, and most importantly, to know how to defend a biblical worldview. And in the last hour, I've helped you do a little bit of both. Go to the website, pointofview.net, and if you'd like to get this PDF, it's available to you. If you'd like to listen to this again, you can download the podcast, or of course, we also have it on our YouTube channel. Let's take a break. We have a lot more coming up right after these important messages.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in the next 2 hours really focusing on economics and finance. And the reason we're doing that is because of all the questions many of you have been asking. You've seen the job growth taking place. You've seen the stock market going all over the place. We even yesterday had some conversations about tariffs and what's that going to do to the economy. Some of you are saying, what in the world am I going to do with my IRA or my 401k? And so we really want to try to get some perspective on that, first from a general point of view, and then maybe give you some ideas of where you could find answers for your own specific situation. So we bring back to the microphone a good friend. Gosh, we've been working together for decades, but Jerry Tuma is the founder.
You don't want to say how many decades.
No,
I see there,
won't say that.
So.
But again, founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services, which is a state-registered investment advisory firm right here in the Dallas area. And I just might mention that material on this program is intended for general information only and should not be taken as specific investment, tax, or legal advice, because everybody's situation is different. But one of the things we're making available, and we'll talk more about this in just a minute, is the latest Cornerstone report. I just love Jerry reading through this because I just go, I don't have the time or the patience or even the intellectual capacity to understand some of these economic trends, but that's what you do, and you do it better than almost anybody I know. So it's just a wonderful opportunity to have you on the program again.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I think you sold yourself short on the intellectual side, but I do have access to some pretty good research here.
It is amazing. Now, before we get into that, because everybody's going to want to know, okay, and by the way, we're going to open up phones later on, so people want to ask their questions about housing. And yesterday we talked about how housing hasn't been a very good investment for millennials, you know, and you predicted that 10 years ago. Right. But nevertheless, people are going to wonder, what's your kind of strategy? And you, I think, would be fair to be calling you a contrarian, because one of the things that you have done is, in addition to your graduate degrees and things of that nature and the work that you've done, is that you actually studied under a man who was a disciple of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. So you come at this, number one, from an economic point of view, a little bit differently. And number two, because you're a Christian, you definitely come at it differently than most financial planners. So give us a little background if you could.
Okay, good. Yes, Kerby, I studied under a disciple of Milton Friedman back in the 70s. This guy was one of the top economic forecasters, specifically about inflation, which was a big deal in the 70s. If you remember the Carter years, high inflation rates. And so macroeconomics has been in my blood. You know, my business degree, with my bachelor's degree was in business with marketing and economics as the minors. I also studied under a guy, actually a mentor, a guy named Dr. James McKeever, who was,
and we've had him on years ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. Well, he passed away some time back. Yeah. But there was about a 10-year mentoring relationship with him, and he shared the speaking platform with Reagan and Greenspan. So, I mean, same size pictures, you know, in the brochures and stuff. So I do look at it a little bit different. And, of course, God's really blessed me with mentors. I wrote our first book with Dr. Tim LaHaye.
That's right.
On temperament and money. And then, of course, the other thing that was Larry Burkett was very instrumental in my life. Those of you remember him. He kind of pioneered Christian-based financial, you know, essentially without him, we don't have Dave Ramsey at this point, you know. So he was the one that pioneered all that. Now, my thing is taking it to the next level, which would be economics and finance and the markets. So what you find out in our world out there is that most Christian advisors, and they can be dedicated, solid believers in every area of their life, but when they deal with the market in terms of their portfolios and the financial plans they put together and their asset allocation models, most of them don't stop to think, wait a minute, the guy that invented this theory that I'm following is a guy named Henry Markowitz, who's not only an avowed atheist, he invented this theory in 1952. They call it modern portfolio theory. I was born in 55, Kirby. I mean, how modern is 1952 stuff? I mean, this is I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver times.
Yeah.
We've changed a few things since then. But not only is he an avowed atheist, he's a math guy. He was never an economist.
Right.
And he created this monster system that our $17 trillion stock market runs on, which occasionally has some big malfunctions, like 1987 crash, 2008 crash, and 1998 nearly melted down with a big hedge fund that blew up. Of course, the dot-coms, every cycle they do something really crazy at the top of the cycle.
Right.
They're doing crazy things now. But the point is they're following a theory put together by an ardent atheist who doesn't even eat his own cooking. He actually admitted in the Miami Herald some years ago.
His own. Yeah.
Won't even use his own formula. He said, I didn't think I'd sleep at night, so I put half in stocks and half in bonds. And so this whole financial planning industry, and I'm not trying to beat him up because I have a master's degree in financial planning.
Right.
So I know how everybody thinks.
Right.
I've been doing this 38 years. But the bottom line is there's an atheistic worldview behind the traditional asset allocation models that most people don't know. So when I was grounded with this, and again, James McKeever was my mentor. He was the #1 investment newsletter writer literally in all history. Top performance, Barron's, you name it. Every year, every 5 years, he'd win the big awards for all that. And there's I guess really you could say a somewhat more simple way to do it in his book, which I think is more biblical. You look at the parable of the talents. Jesus said, hey, here's some money. You know, the master is going to go away. He gives his talents to these guys. Talents was a lot of money back then, by the way. I think I calculated at one point, depending on if the talent was in gold or not, the guy that had the most talents was easily investing more than $1 million. So this was a lot of money. And essentially he said, multiply it, do something with this while I'm gone. Well, they, quote, traded with the assets. Now, I'm not saying you have to do day trading or the extremes of Wall Street, but the theory that I tend to go by is something, well, you could probably write it down if you're taking notes at home. Buy low and sell high. You know, that's kind of a better way to do it. Everybody teaches buy and hold forever.
Yeah.
You know, wait a minute. That presumes the future. So in other words, if you go to James chapter 4, it says, and I'm paraphrasing here, don't say you're going to go into such and such a city and buy or sell, because say if the Lord wills, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Your life could be just a vapor. So the issue, and Larry Burkett applied this to debt, incurring a lot of debt. And the same thing, in my view, applies to buying hold forever type of investment strategies, because essentially you're assuming the future.
Right.
Presuming, if I handed my daughter when she was a teenager, if I had a car and she came and took the car keys without asking permission, that's presuming. So what we're doing there, the principle is don't presume, don't assume the future and what it's going to be like. Instead, in my view, you react. Now, again, react godly. Diversification's in Ecclesiastes.
Right.
Modern portfolio did not invent that. Henry Markowitz didn't discover it. Solomon did around 1000 BC-ish. It says, divide your assets into 7, yes, 8, for you do not know what disaster might befall the land. You don't know which will do better, this or that. So here's my thought. And by the way, I'm not negative about the stock market. We're on our portfolios at Cornerstone. We're fully on offense right now. We're offense. We're all in. But at the same time, we're also looking at what we talk about at this newsletter, preparing for the top. I think the top is not far away. By God's grace, we've called 4 out of the last 5 bear markets months prior to them, starting back when you and I met, 1987-ish. I nailed it. But the bottom line is, I think there's a different way. I realize we're going to come up to the break, and I've been talking too long here, but I think people need to take a different approach that is a biblical approach, and with that, I'll hand you the mile.
Well, again, as we oftentimes like to say, how's this working for you? You know, because if it's working well for you, great. But I got a feeling some of you are saying, okay, I really don't understand these financial markets. I really would like to apply a biblical principle to finances, and I'd like to invest in things that maybe even advance the kingdom, and I'd like to use the resources in a way that honors God. So that's really what we're talking about today. And we've only talked about 1 or 2 aspects that make you unique. Your whole look at demographics, I want to talk about after the break, which makes you even unique among a lot of Christian financial planners. So we'll come back and talk about what that means right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Liberals have been engaged in Nazi name-calling for more than a half a century. It's been a way to vilify and marginalize Republican candidates and their conservative supporters. Harry Truman claimed his 1948 Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, was a frontman for fascists. During the 1964 presidential campaign, the governor of California suggested Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had the stench of fascism. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan replaced him as governor and was called a Nazi so many times, first as governor and then as president, that it would be hard to even get an accurate count. And it has been hard to count all the times George W. Bush and Donald Trump have been given the Nazi label. The purpose of calling candidates and supporters Nazis was to intimidate them and back them off their agenda. But times have changed. Donald Trump and many of his supporters don't seem to care what you call them. Moreover, many other politicians have been called Nazis for so long it's hardly having any kind of meaning or impact. This turn of events has put Nazi name-callers in a difficult situation. Is this all just rhetorical hyperbole, or do they really mean what they say? If it is the former, then they really are just name-calling and don't really believe that the president, other candidates, and their supporters are equivalent to the Nazi regime. But they may really believe what is happening in America is similar to what was happening in Germany in the 1930s. If that is the case, then they feel a moral obligation to take violent action against Trump, Trump's cabinet, and Trump's supporters. The recent speeches and actions by members of Congress and liberal political leaders indicate they aren't just name-calling. They really seem to believe they are fighting evil incarnate. That is why the conflict is increasing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us to Jerry Tuma. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to ask some questions. But even though we're kind of philosophical, I want people to know a little bit about your foundational issues. And certainly you come having questions about portfolio analysis. You come as a Christian really believing that we should apply Christian principles. But there's one other thing that I thought I'd mention before we get into the specifics, and that is you've looked at demographics. Now, you and I have written books on this subject,
Right.
and we recognize that when you look at the baby boom, as it moved through life, it moved through different life stages. And so it was easy to see that when they started wanting to buy houses, the prices of houses would go up.
Right.
When the tail end of the baby boomer got to a certain age, the price of houses would go down. It's just pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious right now that the boom is what? In nursing homes, because they're retiring and they're looking for assisted living. And, of course, you got another baby boom coming behind that, which is actually the millennial boom as well. But you've been looking at this, and this is something which, for reasons I do not understand yet, most economists, even most Christian financial planners, don't pay attention to. So talk
Absolutely,
about that.
and it still boggles my mind, Kerby, that nobody seems to see this, and I can't understand why. It is so obvious. It goes back, we gave you another, real simple rule in the first half: buy low, sell high. Well, this one's kind of the same way: supply and demand. and what we call this our big wave thesis of investing. Basically, what you look at is in the demographics, and you and I, again, you've written a book on this as well. What you're looking for is an outsized wave of demand. And there's a humongous population group heading a certain way. As we talked about, the baby boomers came into the U.S. economy in the early 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, right when Reagan came along. Reagan deregulated, lowered taxes, the boomers hit. It was a perfect storm on a positive side to cause the greatest expansion of wealth in U.S. history, really world history. And that happened up until about 2008-ish when the baby boomer wave sort of subsided. Now, we were, by God's grace, able to say in 1997, we were the KCBI and Preston Wood had a seminar, and we talked about how the housing market would top out around 2005 or 6, simply because we knew how people were spending their money. A typical family spends the most on their housing at about age 44. We knew that the baby boomers topped out in terms of their curve, their birth curve, around 1961. So if you simply add 1961, and 44 together, you get 2005, and that turned out to be exact top of the housing market. Now, we had no idea Wall Street was going to blow the whole world up with subprime derivatives that they leveraged 30 to 1 and all that fun stuff. But the bottom line is, you know, the Apostle Paul, this is another area I guess I would differ with the traditional way they teach the atheistic view of the worldview on finance, is essentially this. They start out by saying, well, nobody has a crystal ball. Well, that's a true statement. Nobody knows the future exactly, but the Apostle Paul said we see through a glass darkly. He didn't say the future is totally unknowable. So there are certain things you can know because they're simple math. You know, again, we didn't project that because we were that much more brilliant than anybody else. We just said, oh, we know people spend their money a certain way, their behaviors a certain way based on their age. They start out in their houses. They go into student housing. If they go into college, they go into apartments after that. Then they buy their starter home. And it's pretty typical how people spend their money. And we knew that the average person peaks at 44 for housing. So therefore, voila, the top was in 2005 and 6. So there are certain things, not everything's that simple, if you will, but there's certain things that you can predict within a reasonable period of time about when it's going to top out. You mentioned nursing homes. Right now, the boomers are getting older. So now we have these baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964 who are in their late 50s up to the early 70s. Now, average nursing home age is age 80. That's when the average person hits nursing home. You got close to 80 million people headed that direction. Here's a real simple clue. How many nursing homes are available in the United States today? The answer, 1.6 million beds. How many of them are occupied? 1.5 million of them are. And you got 80 million people headed that direction. Now, not all the boomers will live to be that old, and some of them will die earlier, and not all of them will go into a nursing home. But you see what I'm talking about, the outsized waves of demand? You got 80 million potential people going that way and 1.6 million capacity. That's enormous. And the developers and the people that build real estate, they never get ahead of the curve. They're always behind the curve. They create a crisis, and then you have a boom. So our thesis, again, on part of how we invest money is you look for those giant waves like they have in Hawaii. Once a year, they have the surfing championships in January, and they have these 50-foot waves that come all the way from Japan, from the storms over there in the South Pacific or the East Pacific, whatever it is, and they ride these 50-foot waves. That's a lot more momentum than the ones at Galveston that are 2 or 3 feet where they don't even surf, you know. So the issue is if you can isolate these big waves of demand, number one, your odds of success are much enhanced. Number two, if you are successful, your rate of success is much higher. That's been my experience. So anyway, that's just another little piece of how the demographics fit into the world of finance.
If you find yourself saying, boy, I'd sure like to get some more information, one of the things we've decided to do, and you're very nice to and gracious to make this available, is we have this 14-page cornerstone report. And if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll see a banner there. It says get your free report, and just fill out that information, and we'll send that off to you, and then you can have all the material that we're going to cover. And we're going to spend some time looking at some graphs and charts. And again, if you have access to the report, you can see all the numbers or just come to the conclusions. But the first one, and I'll just hold it up so people can see it, says preparing for the top. Right now, the stock market is doing very well. Mm-hmm. But again, you want to sell high, right?
Right.
And buy low. And you've looked at some of these indicators. I love these charts because I just can't even imagine the amount of time and effort it takes to put these charts together. But the bottom line is that somewhere along the line, the stock market is going to peak out.
Right.
And there are some reasons for that. People are going to say, we've made as much as we can. We've been able to ride the wave to the top. Of course, yesterday we talked about tariffs. Of course, we also had an article we talked about housing for millennials. So how do you figure out when you say, maybe it's time to get out of the stock market? How do you think that through?
Well, there's a whole lot of factors that enter into that, kind of the economic fundamentals. We also watch chart patterns called technicals. But essentially what happens is recoveries never die of old age. This is the second longest economic expansion ever in U.S. history. The longest one was from 2000, or rather 1990 to 2000, the dot-com era. This one's 9 years and counting at this moment. So, number one, it's an old bull market. It's been around for a long time, an economic expansion. Now, part of the reason we're having such a long expansion right now is that things were so bad under Obama. His policies produced the worst growth rate in the history of our country, literally. We bounced out of the Great Depression better than we did bouncing out of the Great Recession because of all the over-regulation, taxes, and all the antagonistic attitude toward business that came out of that administration. But the old saying again is that expansions don't die of old age, they're assassinated. Who always assassinates them? The same group of people, the Federal Reserve, every time. The Fed has a dual mandate. They're supposed to watch inflation and employment at the same time, which at late points in the cycle almost becomes contradictory because on the one hand, they're supposed to keep full employment or as close as they can to it, which is generally 4% or below, and we're below 4% unemployment now. But the problem is, as you get late in the cycle, after you've been doing this for a long time, as we have, now you're starting to see, which we show on the front page of the report, the job shortages that are happening out there. This is the NFIB, that's a Small Business Association, and the job openings are greatly accelerating compared to the hires. So what you're having is complaints from large and small businesses right now. They can't find enough qualified workers. And so what happens is pretty soon these guys start competing against each other for higher wages, better benefits, higher wages, et cetera. Well, guess what happens? 70% of the cost of a product or service on average is made up of labor and benefits. That means as they're paying more, they're competing for these workers, they're paying more for wages, they're paying more for benefits, the cost of their service or product has to go up. That's what starts the inflation cycle, the inflationary spiral that we're seeing begin right now. It's early. I kind of think, the old saying about a watched pot never boils. I'm a type A person who's really not known for his patience most of the time. So if I'm trying to boil an egg, I'll get over there. Well, are you ever going to work? Come on. You can't hurry it up. But the bottom line is there's a point in time when you're right next to boiling but not ready. You kind of got the bubbles on the bottom of the pot. Mm-hmm. That's where we are right now. We're not quite hot enough to boil inflation-wise, but it's coming in the next 12, 18 months. Average lag time is about 18 months on the economic expansion. And I know I'm throwing a lot of material at people, but it's all in the report. It's all written in the report. But in the next 12 to 18 months, inflation is going to accelerate significantly. Oil prices are going up a lot. That will cause the Fed to have to raise interest rates a lot more than people are expecting right now. And that's what always happens. If you can think of you've seen those crash dummy tests, the car's going 60 miles an hour, hits that concrete wall, and the crash dummy gets kind of shook up. That's what we're getting ready to. There's a collision course between the Federal Reserve and the current economic recovery in the near future, not far out the road. And I've seen this movie before, and I know kind of how it ends. So that's why we wrote the report to Kerby for People, to give them benefit of this information called Preparing for the Top. It's not saying we've hit the top yet, although I think we're getting close. It's preparing, and that's how you basically get the information. You'll know how to prepare.
We're going to talk about some of the obvious application after the break. Again, this is not specific investment advice, but some general ideas. But if you want to know more about the free report, it's available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with Jerry Tuma right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Jerry Tuma in studio today, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Cornerstone Report, we're talking at the moment about what's called preparing for the top. A little bit later, we're going to get into small business explosion, then the issue of inflation, the tightening from the Fed, the old issue of trade wars and tariffs. Probably a lot of that will be the second hour today. And then China makes the world go round. Well, we talked about that yesterday, and we'll get into that as well. 14 pages available to you. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But, Jerry, let me come back to this. Preparing for the top. You're not saying that we're at the top yet. But I got a sense from listening to you that you're saying a year from now we probably will be. So what would that mean? I know, again, we can only give sort of general information, but for people that are saying, okay, I've got money in a 401k, or I've got money in a retirement or an IRA, or maybe a young person saying, I've never invested in the stock market, and these look like great investments. What would you say to some of those people?
Well, first of all, a disclaimer here. We don't know the future for sure. No one does except the Lord. But by God's grace, we've pretty well called most of the major turning points in the stock market. Now, I didn't see 08 coming in terms of we didn't have access to the information about the subprime derivatives, although we did take our accounts to cash way before the big crash. So we were down a little, but not a lot. But we were able to pre-identify, if you want to call it that, the 87 crash, 98 was a big meltdown, and, of course, the dot-com, we said go all to cash at the top of that cycle. So, again, I'm not perfect, but the Lord works in our life. I'll put it that way. Now, so I'm not saying necessarily the top is today. I think the earliest would be possibly next month, literally in August.
Whoa.
At the same time, I could see, I think we're going to have probably at least a correction in the fall. The latest I could see the stock market running would be May of next year. So we're in that window between now and May, in my view, as a topping process. By late this year, early next year, we'll probably start saying, hey, there's going to be trouble coming. And that's what we talk about in the report. Where's the trouble coming from? Because you've got to see the storm clouds on the horizon when they're coming your way, not wait until it's raining and hailing, and now you're going to go into safety. Now, with that said, I can't give what's called a blanket recommendation. So in the old days, I could say get out of the market completely, which I did in 2000 by God's grace. I can't do that anymore. That's verboten against the regs. What I can say is this. Everybody's different in terms of where they are in life, how aggressive they are, how much liquidity they need, what kind of positions they have, do they have tax issues with the stocks or whatever. But I can say this, if someone, in my view, is at or near retirement, I think buy and hold is dangerous to your financial health in the future, because if we have another 50% bear, which we easily could have, that's not the way we think you should do it. Again, that's presuming the future in my book. So in our strategies at Cornerstone, we do not ride bear markets out. We look to either go to safety, or there are ways nowadays that you can actually make money when the market's going down, and that's something I can't get into a lot of detail on this show for regulatory reasons, but that's essentially our philosophy. And again, by God's grace, we've called most of the major turning points since 87. Now, the issue is if you're young, you don't need the money. If it's in your 401k, and if you're content to keep adding money in, it may work out for you. So again, I can only give you some general parameters based on your age. If you're near retirement, that's a different story. The issue, though, again, goes back to presuming the future. Presuming the future means you're assuming, the old saying is the market always goes up in the long run. Well, that's historically accurate. But the ride in 2008 was not a lot of fun for most people. And a lot of people, I had one guy came in the other day who's one of our new clients. He said, I've retired twice already. I'm not retiring again right now because I retired in 2000 before the crash, and then I had to go back to work. Then I retired in 2007 before the crash, and then I had to go back to work. So the issue is, where are you in life? But here's my question, and this sounds terrible to say this, and we need to pray against this ever happening. What happens if you ever have, an ISIS-type person get a nuke someday in America? Where's the bottom that day in the market? That's horrific to say. It makes my stomach hurt to think that. Mm-hmm. But again, that's what I'm talking about, is presuming the future. So there are times, in our opinion, when you should seek shelter or safety. Now, how it applies to your own individual life, that's a different story, and everybody's going to be different on that. Like, every snowflake is different. Everybody's going to be different on how they apply the information. But that's why we're making this information available to you free of charge. The charts that you're seeing there, Kerby, how much time we put I get these charts. I subscribe to them. The service, should I tell you? it's $15,000 a year for their service just to get me the charts. So the research from a company called Bank Credit Analysts, they have 60 economists and 8 offices around the world, been around since 1949. I think it's the best research in the world, literally. And I'm thankful to the Lord that I have that as a resource, because it helps a lot. And again, it fits our philosophy. We don't ride out the bears.
Yes. Again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some questions about this. And so we've just been talking about the stock market. I want to get into small business in just a minute, because I know some of you are small business owners. Others work in small businesses. But if you'd like to join us on air, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that as you receive this report, which you're just very gracious to make this available free of charge, you do have a phone number there. So if somebody wanted to ask specific questions off air, you could do that.
Right.
But what about this issue of small business? Most jobs, and this is something that a lot of people don't know, most jobs are created by small business.
Absolutely.
Not by the big businesses. And small business owners sometimes do better under certain administrations than others. And I say that not just because I have a bias, but the statistics here are striking, because you've put shaded on when you had Republicans in the White House and then when you had Democrats in the White House. And wow. You sort of don't hear that too often in the mainstream media.
No, you don't.
But that again, numbers are right there. People can pay attention to them and read the page 3 on the chart. And what about that? Small business does better under certain administrations and under certain economic conditions.
Absolutely.
Others, right?
Well, the small businessmen have been in there like a turtle inside their shell for the last 8 years. You had antagonistic regulations. I mean, Dodd-Frank didn't affect small businesses directly, but that was one thing that, the Democrats passed to protect the world from the evil bankers, don't you know? And Wall Street deserved to get beat up some about what they did with the subprimes, in my view, and how they blew up the world. But they didn't have to be thrown into solitary confinement and put in a straitjacket and only given bread and water. They passed a bill that was extreme overkill, 23,000 pages at last count, which Trump's trying to do away with. But all of those things, the excessive taxation and regulation, it kind of throttled small businesses. So if you have a small business, you're risking your life every day of the week and your life savings and your job and your house, because everything rides on that. Well, they boom when they get positive treatment. It's kind of like, hey, if I have a restaurant and I treat people rudely and give them bad food, they might not come back. Okay? Well, that's the kind of administration we've had here. And so now we've got an administration that goes, hey, I'm a businessman in my past, and I think we should help the businesses. What about jobs? They create about 70% of all the jobs on average, and we're seeing a literal explosion, a positive explosion in small business hiring right now. And again, the complaint is they can't find enough workers, enough qualified workers. So on the one hand, you got a contrast. That's why I'm saying in Prepare for the Top, the long-term structural changes that have happened with the tax code being reformed, with all the deregulation. Trump, I didn't put it in this one. I'm probably put it in the next one. Trump is on pace to exceed Reagan in terms of deregulation.
And I'd never seen that until that chart. And
he's cutting regulation like crazy. So when you get somebody saying, hey, we're going to help you instead of hurt you, and matter of fact, we even mentioned that in our book, From Boom to Bust and Beyond, which was written in 2008 and 2009, that small business was the way out of this. There's a section 2, growing your way into prosperity. And that was one of the main things we talked about is, get the small businesses to really grow here. That's how to grow your way back into prosperity. But the issue is these small businesses they're booming. The compensation is going straight up. So on the one hand, we have all these structural changes that are very, very positive. And those could happen literally for decades. If we get to Supreme Court, that's going to run for decades. We're changing the school systems with DeVos coming in and charter schools. That could be for decades. It could change America's future with all these kind of things. And these economic changes are the same. However, that does not negate the business cycle, which is an expansion and contraction, and they happen every so often, kind of like the weather. We are going to have a winter, even though it never seems like that in Texas when you're in July and it's 108 degrees on your porch. But the bottom line is there will still be a contraction or a recession coming probably in 2019 or 2020. Why? The Fed's raising rates too high, and we put that chart in there on what's called unprecedented.
Right.
The Federal Reserve is about to take a lot of the soup that they put into the mix a couple of years ago to bail out the banks and everybody else out of the system. It's kind of like kinking a hose, the old days when we had the water sprinklers with a hose, Kerby. You kink the hose, the water sprinkler is going to stop with a lag time. So I think that we're nearing the end. We're not at the end, but we're nearing the end of the business cycle. I think we'll have a recession either sometime in 2019 or 2020 at the latest. That'll cause another bear market for stocks. However, again, the structural changes we're seeing are going to benefit us for decades, unless the Democrats take all of the House, Senate, and presidency and take it all away. This is going to be great for the long term.
And again, when we come back, I want to, first of all, take some phone calls, but you did raise a question about the Federal Reserve, and maybe in the next hour we'll get into what that means and some of those tightening cycles. And really, for some people, maybe they don't even know what the Federal Reserve is, so we'll do a little education there. And then, of course, the issue of the trade wars, too. Well, that's one other issue on the horizon, although I did see some changes even yesterday with the European Union.
Yes.
But we'll come back and take some phone calls first. I know some of you have some questions about inflation, gold, and things like that. Those are all relevant questions. We'll take those right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jerry Tuma in studio today as we talk about economics and certainly finance. And let me just hasten to add that in the second hour, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Federal Reserve and what that means, trade wars and tariffs and China. Now, if you're on a radio station that only carries this first hour, you might want to listen online or get the podcast because this is the other half of the Cornerstone Report. I might even point out this Cornerstone Report is really part one. You got another one coming out later on markets. So we're just covering the tip of the iceberg. But let's see if we can't take some phone calls first. And we'll go first to South Carolina on the Good News Network. Sharman, thank you for calling today.
Hey there. How you doing?
Very good. I know you have a question for Jerry Tuma. Go for it.
Yes, I do. We suffered a great loss in some of our investments in 2008. and that kind of scared myself and my husband a bit. So we've been very conservative with any other investment, but he took out, and I was fine with it, I trusted him, his thrift savings, and he's cashing that in for gold. He says that we're headed for another recession, and it's going to be worse than the other one, and that he's afraid that our pensions are all government-driven. We've got state retirement, both of us, and then we've got military retirement, which is federal. So he said, should the government suffer a hiccup or even worse, then we're going to be in a very bad place.
Okay.
What would you speak to
Had you
that?
said state governments that you're dependent on, or did you say federal government?
Both. We've
Okay.
got two pensions, two state pensions, and one federal pension.
All right. Well, let me give you some thoughts on that. First of all, 2008 was somewhat of an anomaly. In other words, one of the things you've got to be doing when you're dealing with investments is not operating out of fear, and that's hard to do when you've been through a traumatic experience. Because we talked about this in our book, which of course Kerby's read, which is currently out of print. I need to get redone called Smart Money.
We need that book back. Yes, we do.
No,
I've said that to you more than once.
Book.
Yeah.
I need the book.
Anyway, it talks about what we have to do is kind of surrender our thoughts and get at peace, and then ask God for wisdom, and then really heed it. But you've got to, if you're operating in fear, which is very hard not to do if you've been through a traumatic event, that's going to oftentimes lead you down the wrong road. So let me just say this about what we're seeing right now. I do not believe we're going to have another 2008 recession at all. Now, in our book, From Boom to Bust and Beyond, this is something you could get and read. You could go to our website and order a copy of it. CornerstoneReport.com is our website. It was written in 2008 and 2009. Kerby's read it. And we deal with two phases of the crisis, if you want to call it that. One we call the ICE phase, which is a deflationary phase where the banks are in trouble, everything's crashing, real estate's crashing, stocks are crashing. That's the ICE phase. There's a second phase to this crisis, though, which I believe will be called the FIRE phase, high inflation. So I don't believe we're going to have a big crash like 2008 again. The banks are not in big trouble right now. They've throttled back. They're not doing crazy lending like they were in 2008. We will have another recession at some point, I think probably by 2020. It may start in 2019. It may be 2020. So we'll have another recession. But frankly, right now, I think it'll be a fairly mild recession, probably more like we had in 2000, 2001 when we had 9/11. But the bigger issue long term, in my opinion, is going to be inflation. How bad is inflation going to be? And as a matter of fact, Alan Greenspan actually even said this. He's retired now, and I jokingly say he's an old fart now. And so he can say whatever he wants to say. He doesn't have a president or a Senate to be called to account on. And he's saying that the next decade, which I totally agree with what he's saying here, will be called stagflation like the 1970s, where you have slower economic growth. I would make the case it could be faster economic growth with the changes that we're seeing with the tax code and what Trump's bringing in regulation. But inflation at a very high level. Because what we've had in the recent term, we've had the Federal Reserve, and I know we're saving that until the second half of the show, but the Federal Reserve pumped $4.5 trillion of money they created out of thin air into the system to save the banks, the real estate, the pensions, to keep from having another Great Depression. And frankly, it worked. The problem, though, is the federal government is in hock to the tune of $21 trillion now as a result of all the bust. So it took us from George Washington to George W. Bush to accumulate $7 trillion of debt with the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, etc. It took us from George W. Bush till basically now to go from $7 trillion in debt to $21 trillion in debt. And with that, we've got 76 million baby boomers, which are just now entering the government systems for Social Security and Medicare. About a third of the baby boomers are in Medicare right now. That's going to blow the top off the federal budget in the next decade. And no one, I mean literally no one, not the Republicans, no one is touching those entitlements. So what's going to happen is the same thing that happened with housing and the boom in terms of the baby boomers from Reagan on is going to hit that retirement system for the federal government, and I think it's going to blow the top off the numbers. And I think we're headed to what's called truly hyperinflation in the next decade. So with all that said, essentially that's part of what I think you've got to deal with in terms of the future for investing. So again, you can't approach it in fear. You have to have faith that God's going to lead you. James chapter 1 says, when you lack wisdom, ask of God who gives it liberally and doesn't upbraid us for it. But you have to, the condition is you have to believe that he's going to give you the wisdom you need. That's the condition, the faith part. So connect those two together. But I do believe we're going to have really high inflation in the next decade because of all these issues with the federal debt.
I might just mention, too, for Sharman, that you have a whole section on the issue of inflation, and gold is at least one hedge against inflation,
it is.
is it not?
It's probably the single best inflation hedge, actually.
Something.
Now, you can't put all your, Ecclesiastes again says divide your assets to 7, yes, 8 at least. So you can't put all your money in gold. But if you're patient, longer term, we like gold as an asset.
Since you're going to talk about inflation, I always like to bring up my great illustration here. Yep. Anybody looking online will see that I'm holding $100 trillion in Zimbabwe dollars. Now, when many years ago, and you have to go back a couple of decades, the Zimbabwe dollar was worth essentially what the American dollar was, slightly more. And here, this is just one example of 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, and the paper is worth more than what. Right. And that's what inflation looks like.
It does. Hyperinflation.
People oftentimes say, well, the 1930s in Germany. Well, this is more recent. I had a while back a missionary who was actually a missionary in Zimbabwe. And they would go to the market in the morning because as the day went down, the dollars bought less.
Absolutely.
You've never seen anything like this, and you hope that you'll never see anything like this in America. But when you start talking about hyperinflation, those of us that are a little bit older remember what the 1970s were.
That's funny.
Like.
I have a Weimar Republic note in my office in a frame. So we got to remember that historically speaking, and again, this goes back to our book From Boom to Bust and Beyond, Andrew Tyler Frazier is given the quote. He said, essentially, a democracy cannot last as a form of government. It only lasts until basically the citizens figure out they can vote themselves benefits out of the government treasury. And that's sort of where where the liberals take us. They'll go all the way if we let them. That's why I'm fully in the culture war. But the bottom line is, I don't believe there's any way to prevent inflation on a big scale coming in the next decade. And again, that should radically affect the way you treat your investment portfolio.
Yeah. Again, I'll hold it up. There's $100 trillion, and I've got many of these Zimbabwe notes, which I even gave to my producer. And I remember when David Jeremiah was on the program a while back, because he'd written a book on economics, I gave it to him, and he said, are these real? I said, yes. And I gave one to almost everybody in his entourage because, I can give them away because they're not worth anything. So that's what inflation does. That's one of the sections in the Cornerstone Report. A matter of fact, we will get into that in a little more detail, but on page, 4, that's where inflationary spiral. And then we'll get into the Federal Reserve, and we'll talk about tariffs and trade wars and China. So we have a lot more to cover. And even after 2 hours, we won't have covered everything in the report, which is why we encourage you to get a copy of the report. It's at the website, pointofview.net. You can get it. It's free of charge. We'll come back with Jerry Tuma right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have.
They're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jerry Tuma. And let me just mention that if you're just joining us right now, in the first hour, we spent some time talking about the stock market. I'm going to be taking a phone call about that in just a minute. We've talked about small business. We've talked a little bit about inflation. This hour, we're going to get into the Federal Reserve. We're going to talk about the trade wars and about China. And if you find yourself saying, well, this is a lot of material, is there a way I can read some more? I bring you good news. 14 pages in the Cornerstone Report. And we have a link on our website. There's a little banner there that says get your free report. It's 14 pages, and we are covering bits and pieces of it. Again, there's so much more than we can even cover, even in 2 hours, if you can believe that. And so that is available. And so, again, if you haven't had a chance to hear the first hour, I would encourage you maybe to go back and listen to some of that, because it would explain. I asked Jerry really in the first segment and a half to explain kind of his philosophy, how he applies this from a Christian point of view, and how that would differ from a lot of portfolio analysis. And so if you say, these are interesting answers that I would not have predicted. My financial planner has not said that. Why do you say it differently?
Right.
And again, I would encourage you to go back. But we do have a call left over from the last hour as we were talking about stocks. If you have questions today about that, you still can ask. But certainly we're going to get into the Federal Reserve and tariffs and trade wars and inflation and a number of others. But Jerry, let me just at least to go to South Carolina for a minute on the Good News Network. Darlene, I think you have a question about getting out of the stock market, don't you?
Hi, yes, I do. My husband and I are nearing retirement age. And when you talked about getting out of the stock market, that's something that I'm not familiar. I mean, what the process is, if there are late penalties, if the Lord leads us that way. And what do you do once you're out of it? I mean, what's a good thing to do? So I'll just hang up and listen to your reply.
All right. I'll give you some generalized information because, again, I can't give specific investment advice for anybody. Now, if you call our office, that would be different, but I can't do it on a radio, on the air. Essentially here, right now, my thinking, and again, everybody's different. You have different people with different ages, different liquidity needs. Some people have had stocks they may have inherited years ago. So everybody's different, kind of like I said, each snowflake is different. But here's my thinking right now, and that's why we've written a special report called Preparing for the Top. And Kerby, again, if you didn't hear the first part of the broadcast, I mentioned that by God's grace, we pre-identified most of the major turning points in the stock market starting in 1987. Matter of fact, that's when you and I first met.
That's right.
Back when Marlon Maddox was here, and I wrote a series of newsletters. One of them is called 1929 Revisited in March of '87, saying we thought we were going to have a crash in the market that year. And of course, we had the worst single-day crash ever that
That's
year.
right.
So
and I was on the air when it was
trading.
happening, and I was thinking, didn't I just hear Jerry Tuma tell me about that? I was literally doing a broadcast that day.
It was
Amazing.
covering
from Marlon Maddox that day. Yeah.
That, by God's grace, I'll give God the glory on that. But the issue here is, I don't think we're at the top per se, but I think we're getting close. Now, the topping, usually the stock market is a topping process. It's usually not an event. So what that means is it may take 6 months, it may take 9 months. So if I'm looking at the Dow Industrials or the S&P 500, they've been mostly going sideways since January. NASDAQ's hitting new highs. So it's not a bear market, but again, a lot of it is your age, your risk tolerance, things like that, the restrictions, the parameters you have to deal with. So with that, here's what could happen. Again, some people, if a person decides they want to get out of the market, depends on how you're investing. Are you in individual stocks or in a mutual fund? Typically, there's always a money market account associated with your brokerage firm or whatever you're in.
If you're in a money market, you just say move it from stocks into
call
money
on the
market.
800 number, and you just say move it to a money market fund.
And it's as simple as
and
that.
then you're not going to lose money in the next
Yeah.
crash. And again, I can't guarantee that I'll be successful on this, but by God's grace, if we're able to say, yeah, this is the top. Again, I'm not saying it's the top now. I think it's getting very close. Could be next month. It could be next year, but it's not going to last a whole lot longer, in my opinion. So the issue here is, by God's grace, we also plan on telling people when we think it's bottoming in the next cycle. So historically speaking, the market tends to go down. The magnitude of the bear market is not dependent on how good or bad the economy is as much as it is how much debt is in the market, margin debt, which you can measure. We have the highest margin debt ever in the stock market right now as a percentage of the economy, and how overvalued stocks are. So they're not as bad as they were at the dot-com top, but they're close. So issue is really simply, if you decide that you feel like you're being led to get out, then you either want to usually move into, the first move usually would be into a money market account. Then at some point in time, you have to reevaluate, how long do I want to be out? You need some expertise in that area. But again, we're going to be giving you special reports whenever we think that's time. Right now, I just think it's getting close to the top.
I might just mention, and I've said this before, that one of the things you have just on the very back page, and you don't overdo it, but you do have a number that people can call when they get the report. So if they have specific questions, but even as Darlene was asking the question, she might be thinking, well, if I have investment in stocks, then there are obviously going to be tax consequences
unless it's in an IRA or 401k or whatever.
So again, it's probably good to just kind of figure that out. But I just, again, I've been with you now, it's hard to believe, 30 years worth of this, and I've seen you in all but one case predict these. Again, past history is no guarantee of future success, but you've convinced me long ago that you've been pretty accurate at watching these trends and seeing what happens. And so, again, just something to be thinking about. So, Darlene, again, we'll let you determine that. And, again, we're not supposed to, as you said with Charmin, I appreciate that, too, not to be done out of fear. There's so much fear-mongering going on now in the political world, and some of it in the economic world. And we're supposed to have, a sound mind. Isn't that what the Scripture says?
Yes, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of a sound mind. And so the issue here is really that's what we have to do. And, again, that goes back to our first book. We have to ask the Lord for wisdom, but it's part of the process I talked about in that one was get emotionally neutral about the outcome. So in other words, if you're operating in fear, most of the time you're going to make bad decisions. The contrary to that is true. If you're operating in greed and self-sufficiency and presumption, most of the time there you're going to make bad decisions to go in the other direction. So you have to somehow lay your own life down, so to speak, yourself, or the Greek it's called the suke, in our emotions. When Jesus said, pick up your cross daily, he was talking about the suke, which is part of our soul, our mind, will, and emotions. We have to die to that, get emotionally neutral, spend some time with the Lord, and then ask for wisdom, and then make your decision. Because if you're making it out of emotion, it's going to be usually bad.
And I might just mention, I really want that book to come back into print because you looked at personalities, and you recognize that some people are very cautious, and they are ready, aim, ready, aim. You you got some people that are just ready, bang. Wait a minute, I didn't even aim, bang.
They're fire ready, aim.
And unfortunately, I know two individuals that have made rash decisions in the stock market and lost not just thousands, but in some cases millions of dollars because they weren't doing their due diligence. And so sometimes these personalities get us into trouble.
They do.
And not paying attention to some of these facts and figures. But let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Federal Reserve. Because a lot of people, when they're investing, they're thinking, well, the Federal Reserve, that's incidental. And you've got a whole section here about what it is and about the Federal Reserve's tightening, the Federal Reserve's playbook, and a number of other things. So we're going to educate you a little bit about the Federal Reserve, and it's kind of Federal Reserve 101 for a few minutes. And then we'll get into, after that, if we have some time, the trade wars. And, of course, we want to talk about China because that's the big boy in the market, and that's having an impact as well. So a lot to cover. Jerry Tuma, we're blessed to have him in studio here for the rest of this hour. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Liberals have been engaged in Nazi name-calling for more than a half a century. It's been a way to vilify and marginalize Republican candidates and their conservative supporters. Harry Truman claimed his 1948 Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, was a frontman for fascist. During the 1964 presidential campaign, the governor of California suggested Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had the stench of fascism. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan replaced him as governor and was called a Nazi so many times, first as governor and then as president, that it would be hard to even get an accurate count. And it has been hard to count all the times George W. Bush and Donald Trump have been given the Nazi label. The purpose of calling candidates and supporters Nazis was to intimidate them and back them off their agenda. But times have changed. Donald Trump and many of his supporters don't seem to care what you call them. Moreover, many other politicians have been called Nazis for so long it's hardly having any kind of meaning or impact. This turn of events has put Nazi name-callers in a difficult situation. Is this all just rhetorical hyperbole, or do they really mean what they say? If it is the former, then they really are just name-calling and don't really believe that the president, other candidates, and their supporters are equivalent to the Nazi regime. But they may really believe what is happening in America is similar to what was happening in Germany in the 1930s. If that is the case, then they feel a moral obligation to take violent action against Trump, Trump's cabinet, and Trump supporters. The recent speeches and actions by members of Congress and liberal political leaders indicate they aren't just name-calling. They really seem to believe they are fighting evil incarnate. That is why the conflict is increasing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jerry Tuma in studio with us today. Let's, if we can, move to some of the material in the Cornerstone Report about the Federal Reserve, interest rates tightening. I see some of our callers would like to talk about housing, and that fits better after we've talked about the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about this for just a minute. Again, we've done some programs in the past on the Federal Reserve, but that's ancient history, and for some of our listeners, they might say, if you were to ask me what the Federal Reserve is, I couldn't even explain it. Can you help us out?
I can. Basically, the Fed, of course, there's 12 different regional banks that are in charge of their regions. Essentially, their job, if you look at what they've written up, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. They started this central bank. The most important thing the Fed is supposed to do is prevent crises. If you remember, like the It's a Wonderful Life, you know, the standing in line at the bank runs and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Their job is to promote financial stability, not these boom and bust cycles, which we have, which, again, that's a whole other thing. But the most important thing they do, and Milton Friedman was a very vocal critic of the Fed in the 20s, 29 to 33, and when we were having all these bank crashes, instead of providing liquidity, which means if you have to, the Fed can literally print money. Nowadays, they do it with computers instead of with actual printing press, to stem a crisis, so you don't have one bank closing, which then can't pay the next bank, and they just domino down the line. We had a third of the banks that failed in the 30s. The market went down 90% in that time. So he was hypercritical of them at that point. Right now, their primary job is to essentially promote full employment in the economy, try to keep things fairly stable, but also to head inflation off at the pass. So if you remember the Carter years when inflation got out of control, at one point, inflation was up to 18% on a monthly basis, on an annualized. it was just running out of crazy period. I mean, people would say, well, I'm going to buy a car this year, even though I don't need a new one because it's going to cost me 10% more next year, and I'd rather not pay 10% more. So their job is kind of the dual mandate of keeping some financial stability in terms of crashes. So in 2008, Ben Bernanke came along. Now, I was critical of the Fed prior to that because they raised interest rates too high for too long. And I was banging on the table with my head going, they're doing it again, which I think they're getting ready to do this time.
Yes.
So they raised rates too high, too long. They caused a recession. The old joke on Wall Street is the party's going great until the Fed comes and takes the punch bowl away. And at every point in the cycle, they raise interest rates too high. Then they create a recession. They're ostensibly trying to keep inflation from getting out of control because if you let it get out of control, it's like Pandora's box. You can't get it back in there. Mm-hmm. And so their job right now is to head inflation off, to slow things down a little bit. So their goal is to pump the brakes a little bit, not to crash the car. Their track record is terrible at that, though. As you see in the chart that's in there, you're looking at it on that page. In the last 11 times that they've raised interest rates, they've crashed the car 9 of those 11 times.
Yeah.
The only times they didn't crash the car, essentially, was when we were very early in the expansion. We'd only started the expansion, a couple of 3 years before. So the issue is now we're in the second longest business expansion since World War II, really in U.S. history. And to be able to say they're going to be able to tap the brakes lightly and not cause a crash, I don't think so. So I've seen this before. They are also doing something that's completely unprecedented. We have a chart on that. You can see clearly on this page. They printed more money than we've ever seen before. Now, Bernanke, again, I was critical of the Fed before because they really kind of pierced the real estate bubble unintentionally. Whereas they raised rates too high, they caused a recession. We had this gigantic crash. All these banks are going broke. It looks like we're going to the bottom, the black hole. But now they've decided they're going to take that money out. They've printed about $4.5 trillion with computer-printed money, computer-generated money, to buy up liquidity. So they bought U.S. government bonds and notes and bills and stuff like that to put liquidity in the system. They bought mortgage-backed securities to kind of keep the banks from all hemorrhaging, because the point is we lost 3 of the 6 top banks. We can't let them all go under or we have no economy anymore. And so now they're saying, okay, the patient's back on his feet, time to get him off the IVs. Well, that's not really what they're doing. It's more applicable this way. If you think of the U.S. economy as a giant bodybuilder, which is we're the strongest in the world, and we were also in 2008. So Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, he has a heart attack. What do? You can't just sit there and go, well, I hope he gets better. You put him on the table and you pop him with the paddles and get his heart started again. You intervene. That's what that was. That was an intervention that, in my view, was necessary in order to keep the whole system from crashing, because all the banks could have gone under, at least a predominant number of the large banks. I'll put it that way. Now, though, Arnold's healthy again. He's back in this contest. He's showing his muscles. He's got his chest waxed and all that stuff. And he's sitting there and guess what? 10 orderlies grab him, throw him down on the table, lock him down in the straps, and now they're going to drain half his blood out of his body. I'm like, what? What are you thinking? You can't take. They're talking about taking essentially 10% of the liquidity of the entire world out of the system. And that's just idiotic to me at this point. So it's an unprecedented. They had unprecedented intervention, which I was in favor of because it saved us from going into the black hole. But now they're trying to take that out of the system. It's going to be a humongous policy mistake. That's going to create the next crash, in my opinion.
Again, if you want to try to understand things like quantitative easing, or if you want to see some of these charts, you'll really see that
seeing it
helpful.
In vivid color there makes a
Especially
huge
when
impact.
the thing just jumps like that. I've never seen that before. So that then brings us to a good question about buying a house.
Okay.
So let's go to Ross in North Carolina, WLGP. Ross, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, good afternoon to all, and thanks very much for this wonderful information.
And it sounds like you are thinking about buying a house. Tell us more.
Well, I just briefly was explaining I had to take a job out of the state. My family is graduating from high school, so we're going to be moving back together, my wife and I, eventually after my last daughter graduates, so we'll all be back as one again. So there's good things with that. But now I'm hearing on the radio that all this could be happening around 19 and 20. Well, guess what? That's when I'm looking at purchasing a house. So do you wait? Do you purchase before? Do you purchase after? Do you rent for about a year or two, let it kind of settle, and and then buy. I heard about buy low, sell high, and, there was a lot of people that took advantage and made some great opportunities in that last crash.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to do the right thing because I don't want to lose my shirt again.
Okay. Those are some good questions. And again, the stipulation is I cannot give specific advice on anything, but I'll give you some general guidelines of what I think is coming, and then you'll have to make your own educated decision. And I would also encourage you, obviously, to get the special report. Go to the Point of View website to get that. Here's what I'm thinking right now. First of all, I don't see a giant real estate crash coming like we saw in 2008.
No.
Real estate tends to be, it kind of skips every other cycle for some reason. We had a big crash in real estate in 86 to 91 with the savings and loans going belly up and a lot of big tax shelters. And then we did in 2008. But the way that you figure if real estate's going to crash again is you watch the crazy lending.
Yes.
If they're giving 95% loan-to-value ratio loans instead of 65% loan-to-value ratio loans in commercial real estate, it's off. When they're giving, basically here you can borrow $700,000 on a house, even though you may only make $70,000 like they did in 2008, that's craziness. So what's happening right now is you don't have the crazy lending on, because when the crazy lending happens, it pushes the prices insanely too high,
right. Mm-hmm.
And then the people that are marginal or can't pay their payments, they crash, and it's like it gathers.
Yeah, bubble payments, all sorts of stuff.
Bubble just crashes like a snowball rolling downhill. Yeah. Okay, with that said, my guess would be, and this is purely an educated guess, interest rates are going to rise, in my view, for the next year or 2 years, because the Fed is on the warpath about inflation right now. Trump criticized the Fed the other day. And basically, they're not going to listen to them. They're going to get more resolute they've already started raising rates more than they were anticipating.
Just keep going up, don't they?
They're going to keep going up for another year or two, until the Fed realizes, whoops, we've done it again. Sometimes I wonder if Larry, Curly, and Moe don't do a better. No, I'm joking there. Yeah. But the bottom line is, when they realize that they've caused another crash, then they'll start lowering interest rates. So there's likely to be, and again, this is purely an educated guess. You'll have to make your own decision. But there's likely to be a window where interest rates are lower sometime around 2020 or 2021 would be my guess. Maybe as late as 2022. It's too early to tell. Again, we'll try to keep writing special reports and give you more insight as the closer we get to that. But I think real estate probably will soften a little bit, most likely. But I've learned the hard way, Kirby, when I first started Nationwide Radio, all real estate is local. So I can give you
somebody called in a couple of years ago from Arizona, for example, or Nevada. I go, or Florida. Yeah, that was different than what was happening in Texas.
It is, and I don't know the market in North Carolina per se, but I do think that we'll have a lower interest rate. I think rates are going to go up first, which will affect, it's more difficult to buy a house. You can't buy as much house when mortgage rates go higher. But at some point in the early 2020s, I think we'll have a lower low. And from that point forward, I think inflation is going to drive real estate prices way through the roof between then and 2030-ish. But so I think there's a good window coming.
Probably interest rates going up right now.
If it were me, I probably would not be in a big hurry to buy at the moment. That's just me. You have to make your own decision. But rates are going to go up in the short run. Then they'll come down, and then they're going to go way, way up after that, is my viewpoint.
Could be. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Jerry Tuma with us with Cornerstone Report, which we're making available on Cornerstone Financial Services. And if you're just joining us, and I hope if you are, that you will go back and listen to the previous broadcast because we talked about everything from the stock market to small business, inflation. We just a few minutes ago talked about the Federal Reserve, and I want to keep going, and I will get to some more phone calls, so if you're waiting, just be patient. But I did want to talk about two other issues in the report, and they're ones we talk about here. As a matter of fact, even yesterday we talked about it. One is the issue of the trade wars and tariffs, and the other, which relates to that, is China. Mm-hmm. Now, again, I think you are very good and balanced in the sense that you and I and all of us agree with the goal that President Trump has, right, and that is to try to rebalance these trade agreements.
Right.
But the means by which we're getting there with these tariffs, in some cases, have worked. South Korea is a good example. As recently as yesterday, maybe the European Union. China's a different issue. But what about that? Because one of the things that's kind of a headwind right now for people that have money in their 501, the 401ks or whatever it is, the IRS's, IRAs and everything. You know, there's just all sorts of things that people are invested in, or maybe they have money in gold or stock markets, whatever. They're just saying, what does this trade war issue, how does that affect issues of investment?
Yeah, and you used a good word, a headwind. It is a headwind against the economy. So if you look at the chart you're looking at right there is capital expenditure plans. That's where a business will build a plant, equipment, or buy more equipment. They're putting CapEx into their business, and it went through the roof after the tax reform. Trump got in office. They said, hey, a pro-business president, what do you know? We can take that. And small business and large business alike became almost giddy over the prospects of what's going on. And it is showing up in earnings. It's showing up in very, very low unemployment. Again, so all these structural issues are great. Now the turtle's kind of sticking his head back in the hole again. Just when it felt safe to come out, well, guess what? Now we got these trade war deals going. Now, my view on Trump is his objective is good. I'm not going to try to judge his means because I would not consider myself an expert on trade negotiations. But I do believe that they had to be renegotiated because many days they'd gotten out of whack. Other people, if Germany has a 40% tax or tariff on our cars and we have a 10% tariff on their cars, that's not free trade. So free trade, I'm in favor of, and even Trump said that. Let's just eliminate all these tariffs and truly free trade with each other. That's what he said to the European Union yesterday, which may have gotten their attention finally. So, but the bigger issue is China.
Yes.
China joined the World Trade Organization. Of course, they're coming from a communist background where the government controls everything and can kill you if they want to or whatever they want. They're still a communist party ruled. But in 1978, Milton Friedman went over there and started trying to teach them. They asked him to come over. Again, Nobel Prize winner, most important economist in the last 100 years, in my opinion. Anyway, they said, how can we put free market-oriented type systems? They kind of said, well, let's see. The old slogan is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, it was broke. Somebody finally realized this is broke. Deng Xiaoping came in after Mao died, said, okay, I can either export poverty or I can export prosperity. I think we've had enough poverty for a while, 35 years of it. Let's see if we can export prosperity. So he brought Milton Friedman over and said, how do we reform the system? So they started making changes toward a capitalist system like the United States. By the way, spiritually, it's interesting. I don't know if you know Brother Andrew with Operation Blessing. Mm-hmm. They imported 1 million Bibles almost exactly at the same time this was going on, just right after it in the 1980s. For the pastors over there, that most of them didn't even have a Bible, or if they did, they had like one page. So the spiritual side started boosting up at the same time as the economic side started boosting up. What a coincidence, don't you know? Mm-hmm. Anyway, but they began to reform their system. In 2001, they joined the World Trade Organization. Now they're supposed to play by the rules everybody else plays by, the big guys. Now, China wants to be recognized because they're number 2 economy in the world. They want to say, we want to show everybody we have arrived. We are now a player at the top like everybody else. But doing business for foreign entities especially is almost like doing business at the point of a gun, almost like having to deal with the mafia. You've got government control over there. They say, well, you're going to have to give us your technology, your patents or whatever if you want to play here. And China has favored their own industries. It's been corruption to the nth degree. Well, Trump, in my view, has rightly taken them on this. They can't be allowed to steal our intellectual property and all these other things. And a part of the major negotiations, although I realize we're still trying to negotiate with Mexico, which is going to be interesting. Now they have a socialist president. I'm like, oh, no. Mm-hmm. I mean, a real socialist, I think. Like Venezuela, here we come. But the bottom line is getting China to bend, which is not going to be easy. I mean, right now, Trump's putting $200 billion worth of tariffs on their products starting August 31st. I do not believe Trump will back down, period. Art of the deal, he's pretty determined in what he's going to do. I don't think the Chinese are going to just knuckle under immediately either. So this trade war creates a pretty incredible headwind against the U.S. economy and the rest of the world. It'll affect the U.S. less than anyone else because we mostly don't export that much stuff. I think total exports by the U.S. to China last year amounted to $188 billion, and he's putting a $200 billion tariff on the stuff. So, I mean, it's not going to hurt us as bad as it will hurt China. China knows that, but how can they back down there now that they're in the fight kind of thing? So I think that Trump's trying to get Europe to put pressure on China. The issue is that's not free trade if they steal our stuff. So he's got to get China to agree to play by the real rules of the international community. He's got to renegotiate the trade deals with the other people where they've gotten out of whack, out of balance, or where previous presidents have just kind of ignored it and said, oh, well, it's all free trade. Well, it's not free if it's a different set of rules for the other players. So that's basically what he's doing. The problem is it creates a big headwind on the global economy. And last year, bank credit analysts, our research source said about 10% of the global economic trade, or growth in the world is from the United States. So we're kind of a big island by ourselves. We don't export that much. The issue, though, is that China's about 33%.
33%. One-third of all the growth in the world.
One-third of the world's economic growth is from China, and 45% is from other emerging markets.
Yeah.
Which are mostly lined up with China. So that's 78% of the world growth. And both those areas are going to have trouble with this trade war. So it will be part of one of the dominoes, I think, that falls over time. It's going to create issues. It's right now just scaring the market. But at some point in time, it's going to begin to really bite companies, and we're going to have layoffs. But, Trump's going to try to fix that. But the bottom line is it's not a good situation for world economic growth, and I think it's another factor that causes a recession by 2020.
Well, and again, we've talked about some of the political implications, even the 2018 elections, midterm elections. But let's take a phone call before we take a break. And again, we'll take your calls as we go along, but we're just trying to cover all of the pieces that are in this Cornerstone report. At the moment, we were quoting from page 10 on China makes the world go round. And again, one-third of all the economic growth in the world, 33%, right. China.
Amazing.
Let's take a phone call, though. CJ, I think you have a question about managing your account. What would you like to say? Well, there. Are you on?
The show has been so interesting. You guys are so smart. Thank you. Anyway, I retired 2 years ago. I'm a teacher, and still am, always will be. But I'm approaching I can't even say it, 70 in August.
Just a youngster.
And, and I have a 403B with my employer that I have managed myself. Not real well, but they have a 3% guarantee for their fix. So for the past 2 years, because I was scared going into retirement and not wanting to lose any of it, I put 85% in fixed and the rest in the market. I'm more concerned with what do I do at 70 and a half? I know I have to start taking a distribution, and I'm looking for a good financial advisor in South Carolina. Let me say that I've attended 2 seminars. People talk very fast. They seem honorable. But when I look at what they're doing, I'm afraid to buy their product, and I'm not sure it's going to help me. So that's, I don't know if I represent a lot of people, but that's where I'm at right now. I want to be a good steward with the money that the Lord gave me and that I've saved for so many years. So maybe you guys can give me some advice.
Well, again, I cannot give specific advice on radio. Now, we do have a radio. We have a phone number you could call, a website you could go to when you get our special report and read it. Just see if you get a real piece about it. You could always call our office. I can say, and again, I know you're 85% guaranteed, and I'm pretty familiar with the account you're talking about. I'll put it this way. If I were in your shoes, it would give me a lot of heartburn about putting a lot in the market right now. We've had a 9-year bull market. They don't go on forever. The old saying on Wall Street is the trees don't grow all the way to the sky. There's an end to each cycle. But again, I can't give you specific advice. So either if you want to call our office, you could. I would at least get the special report and kind of read through it. I think that'll help you make some decisions. I don't have anybody I could refer you to in North Carolina or in South Carolina rather, that I know. So unfortunately, I wish I could refer you someone there, but I don't. I don't have anybody I can recommend.
But you can talk off air, and you've got an 800 number on the report, so let's make that available. We'll take some more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And again, the special report we just put available on the website, pointofview.net.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Whether it's Tim Tebow, Coach Joe Kennedy, or the thousands of players taking a knee together in prayer after a game, prayer seems to be a popular theme around football. At Wrights High School in Evansville, Indiana, the players value prayer rather highly, it would seem. That became controversial only when a picture of the players gathered in prayer landed on the front page of the local newspaper. Activists sent the school district an angry letter threatening a lawsuit should the school officials refuse to take action. According to them, the coach was violating the law because the picture showed him surrounded by his football players and everyone appeared to be praying. But let's break down that picture a little closer. Yes, the coach was in the center, surrounded by his players, but it clearly shows the players with bowed heads and hands laid on the coach, led by one player whose lips are forming the prayers. The players were praying for their coach. Activists would have this coach stop up his ears and run screaming from the scene of this religious activity, but common sense and the Constitution would call this hostility to the free exercise of religion by the players. Students have a First Amendment right to pray for their coach, and the school cannot legally stop their religious expression. Thankfully, that's precisely what school officials told the activists. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Jerry Tuma in studio with us. Again, founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services. And a couple times you've heard him say that he could give general information, but more specific information you might want to get from him. And again, we have the Cornerstone report, 14 pages. You might say 14 pages. Well, this is just only part one because you're going to do one on the market.
That's right.
And we'll see how people appreciate this. But it sounded already from just a few of the calls we took here today that people appreciate it. You do have your 800 number there as well. But you put this together because what is happening right now is there's just this cacophony of noise and information. Mm-hmm. There's headwinds, there's tailwinds. There's just a lot of factors to consider. And that's before then you realize that somebody who's the age of 24 and could be investing for long periods of time is really different than somebody like we just talked about a minute ago who's 70, right, retired, right, and is managing a 401k or a 403b or an IRA. So it's a little too complex to give anything other than just sort of general principles. But right, once you apply those principles, I think we can see that there are a few things to pay attention to in the future.
Yes, and Kerby, that's one of the reasons we wanted to get this special report out. As you know, we've by God's grace, been able to identify most of the major turning points in the market. We didn't pre-identify 08 because I didn't know what was going on with all the subprime derivatives that were hidden in the balance sheets of the hedge funds off the books on Wall Street. But the bottom line is 1987, 1998, 2000, we said, hey, their bear markets are here or they're about to hit. And usually I'm early. So right now I think I'm also a little bit early on this one. Yeah. And again, I've been trained again to do it completely differently. My mentor, Dr. James McKeever, was a world-class newsletter writer, shared the speaking platform with Reagan and Greenspan, and he also identified major turning points. What do I mean by a major turning point? It's not trying to identify every short-term squiggle in the market. That's simply impossible. No one's ever done that. I don't think everyone ever will. But the major turning points, if you study those turning points, in other words, it's kind of like if you went to the doctor, first thing they're going to take your temperature, take your blood pressure. What are your vital signs? Okay, now what are your symptoms? They start asking you a list of symptoms. That's what we're doing here. If we look back at major tops in the market, which I've done, and I've studied, and I've done this 38-year life work on this kind of stuff, there are certain symptoms that occur, certain things that occur before the top happens. Well, if I were saying there's 10 of them right now, let's say 10 dominoes, I think probably 6 of them have fallen. The other 4 are still there. So right now we're still in a bull market, but we're acting behaviorally kind of weird. The Dow Industrial Average hit a top in January, and it's been going sideways all year long, in spite of the greatest surge of corporate earnings literally in U.S. history. The tax reform and all that stuff, plus we had a lot of headwind, the deregulation, all those things have produced a very positive storm for the economy in the right direction. But in spite of this record earnings, market's flat since, actually Dow is slightly down since January. So that's not normal. We also see the headwinds coming our way, the clouds on the horizon from what the Federal Reserve is going to do. Historically speaking, they are the ones that usually end the recovery. They don't want to. They have to fight inflation. That's a long story. It's in the special report. But the bottom line is they're getting ready to create what I think is a collision with the economy in the next year or two. Matter of fact, it's funny. Most economists think we'll have a recession no later than 2020, the vast majority of them. It could occur a little bit earlier than that in my book because, again, not only do you have the Federal Reserve raising rates too much, you have them taking all the money they printed out of the system and bleeding it out over the next few years. Then the trade wars are not going to be that easy for the global economy. And what's even worse, I remember, Kerby, I do a lot of speaking both nationally and internationally. I did a session in Jakarta, Indonesia, 5 years ago. Big stadium. I don't know how I was there. But anyway, bottom line is one of the speakers was the top 5 wealthiest businessmen in Indonesia, multi-billionaire. And I listened to him. It's interesting. I'm sure you've done this. You're listening to someone talk through an interpreter. That's kind of different experience. Most of what he said didn't really register with me, but the one thing he said that really got my attention, it was just like flashing red lights. He talked about back in the 1990s when he was a businessman. He'd gotten loans from the bank, begged the banks to give him loans. That's how he got wealthy. They said the worst crisis of his life was when he had dollar-denominated loans, because you see these emerging markets, which are 45% of world economic growth.
45%.
They generally have to borrow money because they don't have well-developed financial systems like America. They take out loans. They're dollar-denominated loans, meaning you have to pay them back in U.S. dollars. But if you have the ringnat or whatever your currency is, and your currency is going down and your economy is going down over there, you don't have the revenue. The revenue is coming in the wrong currency, and the dollar's appreciating in value. So the value of your loan is actually increasing, the principal, if you will. So if you have $1 million business loan and the dollar goes up 20% against your currency, now you have a $1.2 million loan.
That's right.
And the Fed's raising interest rates on that loan on top of that. And if you're not an oil exporting country, they're getting hit with oil prices increasing. So I think there's a perfect storm developing. Now you may say, well, who cares about Malaysia? Well, you better care. Over 50% of world economic growth right now, over 80%, almost 80% of world economic growth is China and these emerging markets.
Right.
Smaller economies, they're kind of in their puberty years. They're out of their childhood, but they're not mature yet.
And again, we're at 10% and they're at 45%.
Yeah, and those guys, I think, are going to head, and the amount of dollar-denominated loans they have today is much worse than it was in 1994 before we had the last crisis. So I think what we're going to see, I believe the U.S. is going to weather the storm well. In other words, I think it'll be a mild recession in the U.S. It's probably going to be a severe bear market, though, because stocks are very pricey. They're expensive, and they're over-leveraged right now.
Yeah.
Margin debt's record. It's going to be a good opportunity for everybody, and if you have a buy low, sell high opportunity type mindset. But I think the next decade, again, I think is going to be peppered with very high rates of inflation as the Federal Reserve is forced at that point to buy a lot of our government debt to cover all. Again, the national debt's gone from $7 trillion to $21 trillion since Bush left office, and that's barely starting with the baby boomers in Medicare and Social Security, only a third in there. So there's a day of reckoning coming. The only way I know of it, historically, if you look at how governments will take care of things like this, it's too difficult to tax people too much, plus you're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, economically wise, if you try to tax people too much.
So we'll print more dollars, right?
We'll print more.
As I hold up
it
my
might
Zimbabwe
or might not be
dollar
that bad
here.
with the Zimbabwe, but that's the way governments have always gotten out of it. It's too unpopular to cut the benefits. You know, my wife Mona went up to Washington, D.C. with a friend of hers and worked on some spending in the National Institutes of Health. She went in and saw the chief of staff of K. Bailey Hutchison, no less, who was on that committee. And she set him up by, I'm from Texas. I'm here to talk about it. First words out of his mouth, we're not here to cut your spending. We're not here to cut your benefit. And then she flipped open a website that showed all the porn studies that they were funding with our tax dollars. And he literally almost fell over in his chair. And he said, that's not the national. She said, it is. He said, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We get 1,000 calls, don't cut my benefit, to every one person like you that says we need a cut. And unfortunately, that's the way the political machine works in Washington.
Yeah.
So get ready.
So
Get ready,
again,
because challenging times create opportunity.
One of the ways to get ready is through the Cornerstone Report. You know, the first one is on preparing for the top, and that's one of the things we talked about. One of the others is on inflation. And again, I'll hold up my $100,000 Zimbabwe note and say, let's hope that is not a preview of coming attractions here in America. But you got to be an honest broker and an honest evaluator of what is taking place. So that's one of the reasons, Jerry, I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you, Kerby.
Giving us 2 hours. Founder and president of Cornerstone Financial Services. Even though we're going off the air, there's still an opportunity for you to get that free report. 14 pages, want to put it in your hands, and then you can do with it what you want. But we've had so many questions about what about the tariff? What about the trade wars? Do you think the stock market is going to keep going up? Do you think the policies that have been implemented by President Trump are going to work? And what should I do in terms of buying a house, in terms of investment? We've tried to cover some of it. And if there's interest in this, we'll do another one. And I know you have a part 2 coming up anyway. So that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. We'd love to see you then, right here on Point of View.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.